I used to work the night shift at a factory just outside of town. After a long night, nothing cleared my head better than a quick trip to the lake with my fishing gear. It was a routine for me, a small reward for getting through another shift. There was this old, secluded lake just off a winding road that no one else seemed to know about. Perfect for solitude. One morning, just as the sky was starting to lighten, I made my way to the lake. The place was as empty as ever, the air thick with fog. The mist rolled across the water like ghostly fingers, twisting and curling as if alive. I shrugged it off, blaming my sleep-deprived mind. Besides, the lake was usually foggy at that hour. I set up near the edge and cast my line, letting my mind drift. There was something peaceful about the isolation, the way the world fell away, leaving just me and the quiet. But as the sun began to rise, casting an eerie, pale glow over the fog, I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of nature were gone. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. Just complete silence. It was like the whole area was holding its breath. I shifted uneasily, feeling a strange pressure in the air, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. Still, I tried to ignore it, focusing on my line and the water. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I'd stayed up too late or drank too much coffee. But then, just as I was beginning to relax again, I heard it. A faint splash in the distance, like something heavy breaking the surface of the water. I whipped my head around, scanning the lake, but there was nothing. Just the fog and the still, silent water. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was probably just a fish. After all, this was a lake, fish splash. Moments later, it happened again. Closer this time. I gripped my rod tighter, squinting into the mist, trying to see what had caused it. The fog was too thick, but I swear I could make out a shape, a dark figure just under the water, moving slowly toward me. It was huge, bigger than any fish, gliding silently beneath the surface. A chill ran down my spine, and I took a step back, the edge of the lake's muddy shore giving way under my feet. But the figure stopped, hovering just a few feet from where I was standing. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. I wanted to pack up and leave, but a strange feeling washed over me, something I can only describe as a compulsion. It was as if the lake itself was holding me there, waiting for something. Then, out of nowhere, I felt a sharp pull on my line. I staggered forward, nearly losing my balance, and instinctively started reeling in. Whatever was on the other end was strong, far stronger than anything I'd ever caught. It yanked and tugged, dragging my line deeper into the water, pulling me toward the edge. I planted my feet, gritting my teeth as I fought to hold on. As I pulled, I noticed something disturbing. The figure under the water was moving with my line, as if it were attached to whatever I was reeling in. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the dark shape get closer, the water rippling around it, the fog swirling like a shroud. It wasn't a fish. It was something else, something unnatural. Finally, with a final heave, I yanked the line free, pulling whatever it was out of the water. But what I saw made my blood turn cold. It was a doll, a large, old-fashioned doll, soaked and covered in grime, its porcelain face cracked and worn. Its eyes were missing, just dark, empty holes staring up at me. The dress it wore was rotted, the fabric barely clinging to its delicate frame. I froze, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would a doll be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at the bottom of a lake? Before I could process it, the doll's head tilted slightly, as if it were looking at me. I stumbled back, dropping my rod, and as I did, I heard a faint whisper, so quiet I thought it was my imagination. "Help me." The voice was soft, childlike, but there was something twisted about it, something that made my skin crawl. I shook my head, backing away from the water, but the doll didn't sink back. It floated there, bobbing on the surface, those empty eye sockets fixed on me. Then, without warning, the doll began to move. Slowly, almost mechanically, it started to drift toward the shore, its limbs twitching and jerking as if some invisible force was controlling it. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, watching as it dragged itself up onto the muddy bank, its broken, decaying fingers clawing at the dirt. I turned and ran. I didn't look back, didn't care if I left my gear behind. All I could think about was getting away from that lake, from that thing. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short gasps as I crashed through the trees, branches scraping against my arms and face. When I finally made it to my car, I threw myself inside, locking the doors as if that would somehow keep me safe. I sat there, shaking, my mind racing with what I'd just seen. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that those empty eyes were following me home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that doll, heard that whisper. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the fog, a strange coincidence. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd disturbed something at that lake, something that wasn't meant to be found. It's been months since that morning, but the nightmares haven't stopped. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear that voice, faint and distant, whispering from the shadows, "Help me." I've never been back to that lake. I've tried to forget, to push the memories away, but they cling to me, haunting my every thought. I don't know what I found that day, or why it called out to me. But I do know one thing: there are things in this world that should stay buried, hidden in the dark places where no one can find them. And some mysteries are better left unsolved. When I was young, my family owned a small lake cabin out in the middle of nowhere. It was an old, creaky place, but it was ours, and it held some of my best childhood memories. Every summer, my family and I would pack up and spend a few weeks there, fishing off the dock, swimming in the clear water, and telling stories by the fire. But one summer changed everything. I had just turned 16, and it was my last summer before starting a part-time job that would end my childhood tradition of spending every vacation at the cabin. I remember feeling restless, like I had to make the most of it. One night, just as the sun was setting, I decided to go fishing alone. The lake was calm, almost glass-like, and there was a kind of quiet that only exists in the woods. I walked down to the old dock that stretched a few feet into the lake, my fishing gear in hand. As I set up my rod, I noticed how the water seemed darker than usual, almost black in the fading light. The sun had dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows that crept across the lake, swallowing the last bits of daylight. Still, I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I cast my line and settled onto the edge of the dock, letting my legs dangle over the side. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. The lake remained silent, without even a ripple disturbing its surface. I was just about to pack up and head back when I felt something, a subtle movement in the water beneath me. I froze, looking down into the dark water, straining my eyes to see what might be lurking below. But the water was too dark, almost like ink, and I couldn't make out anything. Then, out of nowhere, a chill ran through me, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I don't know what made me look down, but when I did, I saw it. A face, just below the surface, staring up at me. It was pale, almost ghostly, with sunken eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. I gasped, pulling my legs up onto the dock as fast as I could. But as I looked closer, the face was gone, swallowed by the dark water as if it had never been there. I sat there, breathing heavily, trying to convince myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. It was real, and it was watching me. I decided to head back to the cabin, but as I gathered my things, I heard a sound, a soft, whispering sound, like someone calling my name. It was faint, barely audible over the gentle lapping of the water against the dock, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was out there. I stood up, looking around, but there was no one. Just the empty lake stretching out in front of me, silent and still. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the wind or some animal, but the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I packed up my gear and started back toward the cabin. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a shadow, dark and shapeless, moving beneath the water near the dock. It wasn't a fish and it wasn't debris, it was something else. I watched as it drifted closer, circling just below the surface like a predator stalking its prey. I could feel its eyes on me, could sense its hunger, its malice. In a panic, I started running back to the cabin, my footsteps echoing on the old wooden planks of the dock. But as I reached the shore, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks, a splash, loud and violent, as if something had just leaped out of the water behind me. I didn't dare turn around, I just kept running, my heart pounding, my mind racing with fear. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I stood there, breathing heavily, listening for any sound, any hint that I'd been followed. But all I heard was silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every sound making my heart race. The wind rustling through the trees, the creak of the old cabin settling, even the sound of my own breathing. It all felt wrong, like the lake had followed me inside, like its dark, murky water was seeping into the walls, drowning me in shadows. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They laughed it off, saying I'd just let my imagination get the best of me. But I knew better. I knew that whatever I'd seen was real, and it was waiting for me. For the rest of the trip, I avoided the dock, refused to go near the water. But on our last night at the cabin, I found myself drawn back to it almost against my will. I walked down to the shore, the moonlight casting an eerie glow over the lake. The water was still, silent, but I could feel something watching me from below, lurking in the depths, waiting for me to come closer. I stayed there for a few minutes, staring out at the lake, a strange feeling of dread washing over me. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it again, the shadow moving beneath the water, slowly drifting toward the shore. I watched, frozen in place as it rose up, just below the surface, its dark form blending with the night, its eyes fixed on me. I ran back to the cabin, my heart pounding, and didn't sleep a wink that night. We left the next morning, and I haven't been back since. But sometimes, late at night, I'll dream of that lake, of the shadow beneath the dock, waiting for me to return. I don't know what it was or why it chose me, but I know one thing: there are things in that lake, things that don't belong in this world, and they're waiting, watching, lurking in the shadows, ready to pull anyone foolish enough to come too close into their dark, watery depths. Two summers ago, I took a solo camping trip to a remote river spot I'd heard about through some friends. They said it was the perfect place to unwind, to get away from everything. A pristine river surrounded by thick woods where you could cast a line and just lose yourself in the peace and quiet. When I arrived, it was exactly as they'd described: beautiful, isolated, and serene. I set up my tent a few yards from the riverbank, the sound of the water lapping against the shore already making me feel calm. I'd planned to fish, cook what I caught over a fire, and spend the night under the stars. Little did I know, the peace of that place was only on the surface. Beneath it, there was something waiting. I started fishing around midday, casting my line and settling in on a large rock by the river. The water was crystal clear, and I could see fish darting through the currents below. Hours passed, and I lost myself in the rhythm of the river, the gentle flow of the water, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. As evening approached, a chill crept into the air, and the forest around me grew darker. Shadows stretched across the river, making the water look almost black. I told myself it was just the fading light, but I felt uneasy, like someone was watching me. I brushed it off as first night jitters and focused on my line, waiting for a bite. Then I heard it. A low, raspy voice, almost like a whisper, drifting over the water. Need help? I whipped around, searching for the source of the voice. There was no one there, just the empty riverbank stretching out on either side of me. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the only response was the echo of my own voice fading into the trees. I laughed nervously, convincing myself that I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind, or the water moving over the rocks. I went back to fishing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. Just as I was about to pack up, I felt a sharp tug on my line, stronger than any fish I'd ever caught. I gripped the rod, reeling it in, my excitement mixed with a strange sense of dread. Whatever was on the other end was heavy, pulling against me with an unnatural strength. My hands were shaking as I reeled it closer, the line cutting through the water with a hiss. Finally, I pulled it out of the water, expecting to see a large fish. But instead, I found myself staring at a small, waterlogged notebook, its cover blackened and worn. I held it in my hands, the pages swollen and sticking together. There was no name, no indication of where it had come from, but it felt wrong, like it shouldn't be here. I flipped through the pages, struggling to read the faded words, but one phrase stood out, written over and over in frantic, scrawled handwriting. "Don't look at him." A chill ran through me, and I dropped the notebook back into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface, disappearing into the murky depths. I didn't understand what it meant, but something about those words filled me with a deep, instinctive fear. Just then I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing on the opposite bank of the river. He was tall, with dark clothing and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them, boring into me from across the water. My body froze, every instinct screaming at me to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped, held in place by his gaze. He raised a hand, his movements slow and deliberate, and waved. It was an odd wave, almost mocking, as if he were daring me to come closer. I could barely breathe, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared back at him. The river felt like it had gone still, the air heavy, pressing down on me. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. One moment he was standing there, watching me, and the next, the riverbank was empty, as if he had never been there. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but he was gone. And yet, the feeling of his eyes on me lingered, like a dark stain that I couldn't wash away. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the isolation and the fading light were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew he was real, and I knew he was still watching me. That night I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. Standing on the riverbank, staring at me with those empty, hollow eyes. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, every rustle and creak making my heart race. The river seemed louder than before, the water lapping against the shore in an endless, unsettling rhythm. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the gravel by the river. I held my breath, too afraid to move, listening as the footsteps drew closer, stopping just outside my tent. I lay there, my body rigid with fear, my mind racing with 1,000 horrible possibilities. I wanted to look, to see who or what was out there, but those words from the notebook echoed in my mind, "Don't look at him." So I stayed still, my eyes squeezed shut, praying that he would leave. The footsteps lingered, moving around my tent, circling me as if he were waiting for me to look, to acknowledge him. But I kept my eyes closed, refusing to give in to the fear that clawed at me. Eventually, the footsteps faded, disappearing into the night, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too afraid that if I closed my eyes, he would come back. At first light, I packed up and left, not daring to look back at the river. The whole way home, I felt his presence, like he was following me, watching me from the shadows. Even now, I still see him sometimes, in my dreams, standing by the river, his eyes locked on mine. I don't know who he was or why he chose me, but I know one thing. I'll never go back to that river. Because some things aren't meant to be seen. Some things are meant to stay in the dark, waiting for the next person foolish enough to cast their line into that cursed water. I've always loved fishing, especially in remote, quiet areas where there's no one else around. There's something calming about casting a line and sitting by a silent lake, just me and nature. About 2 years ago, I found this secluded lake about 40 miles out from my hometown. I'd never seen another soul there, and for months it had been my go-to spot. That is, until something happened that I can't explain. It was late October, just after dawn. A light fog hung over the lake and there was an eerie stillness in the air. I was the only one there, or so I thought. The lake was quieter than usual, with no birds singing, no breeze rustling the leaves. Just dead silence. I shrugged it off as one of those calm autumn mornings and set up my gear by the edge of the lake. As I sat there, I noticed a small, abandoned boat floating about 20 feet from the shore. It looked old and beat up, the paint peeling off and the wood rotting in places. I'd never seen it there before. Curiosity got the best of me, so I grabbed a branch and pulled it closer. That's when I saw something unsettling. A single, muddy boot lying on the floor of the boat, half buried under some leaves and debris. Something about it just felt wrong. The boot was too clean on the inside, like it hadn't been out there for long. I started fishing, trying to ignore the strange boat. Hours went by, and I didn't catch a single fish. The water was still, not even a ripple, which was unusual for this lake. I decided to pack up early. As I was winding up my line, I felt a chill run down my spine, the kind that makes your whole body freeze. I looked up, and that's when I saw him. Standing on the opposite side of the lake, almost camouflaged by the mist, was a man. He was just staring. I couldn't make out his features, he was too far away. But I could feel his eyes on me. I wanted to look away, to get out of there, but something held me in place. He raised his hand slowly, as if to wave, but his fingers were twisted, almost deformed, like he was struggling to move them. I turned away for just a second, my heart pounding, but when I looked back, he was gone. No sound, no movement, just empty shoreline where he'd been standing. I tried to tell myself it was just a shadow or a trick of the fog, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I grabbed my gear and practically ran back to my car. As I was packing up, I heard a splash behind me near where the boat had been. When I looked back, the boat was gone. It had just vanished, leaving only ripples on the surface. But the water was moving, and in the reflection I saw that man's face looking back at me, his hollow eyes fixed on mine. I drove away as fast as I could, and I haven't been back to that lake since. I can still see his face in my nightmares, staring at me from across the water, waiting, watching. Growing up, I spent a lot of summers at my grandfather's cabin in the woods, a few miles away from a small, nearly forgotten pond. The locals called it Dead Man's Pond, but no one ever told me why. My grandfather was a quiet man, the kind who kept his stories to himself, but he warned me never to go there alone. As a kid, I listened. But as an adult, I thought of it as just an old legend, something meant to scare kids. One summer, I finally decided to give Dead Man's Pond a try. It had been years since I'd been to the cabin, and I wanted to see if I could get a few hours of peace and some good fishing. I grabbed my gear, told myself it was just another pond, and made my way through the thick woods, following an overgrown trail until the pond came into view. The place felt strange right from the start. The pond was murky and dark, with a greenish tint that made it look almost unnatural. The air was thick, heavier than usual, and there was this sickly sweet smell like something rotting. I figured it was just swamp gas or decaying plants and brushed it off. After all, I was here to fish, not to let my imagination get the best of me. I set up my rod and cast my line, watching the water ripple as it landed. For a while, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The forest around me seemed almost lifeless. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just silence. I felt a little uneasy, but I pushed the feeling aside and kept fishing. After about half an hour with no bites, I felt something tug on my line. Hard, excited, I began reeling it in. But whatever was on the other end felt heavier than any fish I'd ever caught. I struggled with it, wondering if maybe I'd snagged some debris, but then I felt it tug back. A sharp, insistent pull that sent a chill down my spine. As I pulled the line closer, I saw something break the surface. At first, I thought it was a fish, maybe a big one. But as I looked closer, I realized it was a hand. A human hand, pale and bloated, fingers twisted and swollen. I froze, staring at it, unable to move or even breathe. The hand was attached to something, or someone, just below the surface, but I couldn't see who. It was as if the water was hiding the rest. The hand started moving, writhing as if it were trying to reach me. I dropped my rod, stumbling back in shock, but the hand didn't sink back down. It stayed there, floating near the surface, the fingers curling in a slow, unnatural way, almost beckoning me to come closer. I felt my heart pounding, every instinct screaming for me to leave, but I was rooted to the spot, too horrified to look away. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that hand. Then I heard something, a voice, faint but clear, whispering my name. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a friendly voice. It sounded angry, desperate, like someone who had been left alone for too long. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my tackle box. That's when I noticed the water. It was changing, shifting from a dark green to a deep, murky red. It wasn't just the hand in the water anymore. I could see faint outlines, shapes, moving just beneath the surface, like shadows waiting to emerge. The whole pond seemed to come alive, rippling and bubbling, almost as if it were breathing. I turned to leave, finally breaking free from the trance. But as I did, I heard something splash behind me, close to the shore where I'd been standing. I forced myself to look back, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. The figure was slowly pulling itself out of the water, its arms clawing at the muddy shore, its eyes fixed on me. It was human, or had been at some point, but its skin was pale, almost translucent, and covered in patches of greenish algae. Its face was contorted, lips drawn back in a grimace, as if it were in pain or angry. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, branches scraping against my face and arms. I didn't care, I just had to get away. I could hear it behind me, dragging itself along, its heavy, wet breathing echoing through the forest. I don't know how far I ran, but by the time I reached the cabin, my lungs were burning and I could barely stand. I locked myself inside, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I closed the blinds, checked the locks, but the feeling didn't go away. I spent the night on the floor, clutching a flashlight and listening for any sound outside. In the morning, I left the cabin, refusing to look back at the forest. I've never returned, not to the cabin, not to that pond. A few months later, I tried to find some information about Dead Man's Pond, some explanation for what I'd seen. I learned that years ago, a man had drowned there. People said his body was never recovered, that he was still waiting for someone to pull him out. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that voice, whispering my name, beckoning me back to the pond. But I know better. Whatever is waiting in that water is something I'll never face again.